guys, nice to see you again. This is our third session in our series After Eden. After Eden. So we're looking at what happens to humanity, to Adam and Eve and their family, right? The basis of humanity after the Garden of Eden. And what happens to them back then in this story in the Bible is actually the biblical authors trying to paint a picture for you and me of why we are the way that we are right now, why humanity is the way that it is right now. So we see being played out in these first few people right now. We've seen Adam and Eve, and last week we saw Cain and Abel. We see this drama of sin, right, that has invaded humanity and has turned us away from God and has, in certain ways broken us. And last week we looked at how it had actually caused Cain to murder his brother Abel. Some pretty serious stuff. This effect that sin has on us after Eden, after we leave God's good creation, is really, really serious. And we still experience it today. And these stories set us up to understand what sin is, what God's going to do about it, and what our response should be. Those three things are super important for us to understand. And it's sort of hard to understand when I say it like that, but as we get into these stories, the authors put it in these beautiful pictures, right, that make us understand. Instead of trying to just tell us exactly what we need to do, they show us what we need to do through the stories of these first people. So Adam and Eve sin, and they defy God, and they decide to define right and wrong for themselves, and they have to leave the Garden of Eden. So they are the first people after Eden, and now there's all sorts of hard stuff going on. There's pain and brokenness and death and all of this different stuff. And we see that intensify in their son Cain as he kills his brother Abel, and we say, wow, sin still has a hold on the human race. And it's a really big bummer. It's a really big bummer. Remember this. You got to keep this in your head, because God promised Adam and Eve that one of their descendants would ultimately defeat sin, would defeat the serpent, right, that represents sin, that tempted Adam and Eve to sin in the first place, would defeat Satan and bring the human race back to the way that it's supposed to be. But we saw that it wasn't Cain, right? We saw that Cain really messed it up. But we're going to look at the second half of chapter 4 today, and we're going to figure out what happened to Cain after last week's story. And this is what it says. And Cain laid with his wife, and she became pregnant, and she gave birth to Enoch. Then Cain founded a city. So this is the first city that we've heard of, right? Which he named Enoch, after his son. Enoch had a son named Irad, and Irad became the father of Mehujal, and Mehujal became the father of Methushal, and Methushal became the father of Lamech. Now Lamech married two women. Remember, God created man and woman together in partnership, and Lamech is descendant of Cain, who murdered his brother and who built the first city. He marries two women. The first was named Adah, and the second was named Zilhah. And Adah gave birth to Jabal, who was the first one to raise livestock and live in tents. And his brother named Jubal, the first who played the harp and the flute. And Lamech's other wife, Zilhah, gave birth to a son named Tubal-Cain. And he became an expert in forging tools of bronze and iron, and Tubal-Cain has a sister named Naamah. One day, Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zilhah, hear my voice, listen to me, you wives of Lamech. I have killed a man who attacked me, a young man who wounded me. If someone who kills Cain is punished 7 times, then the one who kills me will be punished 77 times. Wow. So we see, even as things got worse from Adam and Eve to Cain and Abel, things have gotten even worse in Cain's descendants as they have strayed farther and farther away from the plan and promise of God. There's some real brokenness going on. But there's also, right alongside it, all of these advances. Did you catch them? Right? Cain settles down and he builds the first city. He builds the first city, and we're like, wow, that's pretty neat. This center of commerce and culture, the first city, is built by Cain and named after his son, Enoch. And then there's this guy named Lamech. And Lamech has another first, but this first isn't so good. Lamech is the first guy to take 2 wives and to break the form that God had set for men and women to marry and have children and love each other. Lamech instead takes 2 wives for himself, because we see later that this Lamech is this violent, taking guy, that he does what he wants. Even like Cain killed his brother in anger, right? Lamech kills a young man because he hit him, right? And he kills him and he comes back and he makes a song about it and he brags about it to his 2 wives, about how he can kill people with impunity. We go, wow, things have gone south in the descendants of Cain. But also, again, they see all these things. We see that the sky starts hurting. And this is a son of Lamech. This evil dude starts hurting and building tents. And another one of his sons starts making musical instruments. And another one of his sons starts smelting metal and making all of these really useful tools. And we see that even though Lamech is evil, and even though the descendants of Cain are so filled up with sin, that they are still producing all of these useful, powerful, innovative things, that humanity is progressing. Like they're growing, they're flourishing, they're learning, and they're getting more knowledge and power. But they're not, notice, they're not getting closer to God. They're not getting better. They're not getting closer to the truth. In fact, they're getting farther and farther away from it. Sin continually takes them over more and more and more as they progress in knowledge and power and know-how and all of these things that we view as progress, right? We look at their progress and we see that in the really important area, that their progress is lacking. That if we look back at Eden and we compare it to where they are now, sure, they've got metal tools and music and all this stuff that is good and cool and that humanity has had the chance to create because of how God made them special. But they're missing something super, super important. We see stuff like this in the world today. We have a sort of idea that we, as humans, are advancing and we keep on advancing, and that everything behind us, all those people who came before us, were really kind of silly and stupid, and they really didn't know what was going on, and they didn't have things figured out. But we today, oh man, we have cars and planes and computers and smartphones and medicine, and we sent people to the moon, right? And all of these things, we think, we're so advanced. We're doing all this good. We're clearly know what we're doing. We clearly have our stuff together. And all those people who didn't have that stuff before, they don't know what they're talking about. But this ancient text, the Bible, says to us, they say, listen, you may have built up civilization and found all these new things, and you may be able to play the lute or farm or herd, right? Or make things out of metal, or you may have cell phones or cars or build skyscrapers or go to the moon, but maybe, because you're human and because you're broken, you still haven't figured out what this sin deal is. Even though you can do all these things, war still happens. Death still is prevalent. People still can't get along, and they still hate each other and murder each other and attack each other and brag and are selfish. We go, wow, Genesis has painted us pretty well, hasn't it? As this self-centered, prideful people who have so much potential to create these awesome, cool things, but are still bound by sin. And we see a glimpse maybe of what humanity could be if they had followed God and they had created underneath his direction. Imagine what awesome things humanity could have made if they wouldn't have rebelled against God. And they wouldn't have had this issue of sin, but they could still build cities and still make tools and still make music. It would be awesome. But that's not the picture that's painted. The descendants of Cain are mired, stuck in like a swamp of sin. And they've built their city on the swamp of sin. And as magnificent and awesome as it is, that sucker gonna sink. That sucker gonna sink. And we go, well, what hope is there for humanity? Because I thought that we were advancing, and maybe we could advance far enough, and we could learn enough, and we could figure out enough, and we could discover enough, and we could build enough that maybe I would actually be content, that we could save ourselves. And Genesis says, no, that's not how it works. Even as you advance, your sin corrupts it. So we say, man, where is that descendant of Adam and Eve that is going to defeat sin once and for all? And you and I know that that's going to come from Jesus. But we see God being faithful to the promise to send Jesus, to bring Jesus to save us here in the last 2 verses of chapter 4. As we do a little sort of flashback, we say, while all this is happening, right, we've been looking at the descendants of Cain, and they're building their city on the swamp of sin, and it's beautiful, but the swamp of sin is going to swallow it. And we pan back to Adam and Eve, who are still, out. Cain has left them, and this is what it says. Adam lay with his wife again, and she gave birth to another son, so a third son, not Cain or Abel, and she named him Seth. For she said, God has granted me another son in the place of Abel, the good son, whom Cain killed. And when Seth grew up, he had a son and named him Enosh. And at that time was the first time when people began to worship the name of the Lord. So, on one hand, we've got Cain, who's gone his own way and rejected God, and he's built this shining city on this big old swamp, but we see that God is faithful, and he's bringing hope back to humanity. Through the big shining city? No. He's bringing hope back to humanity through this youngest son named Seth, who's going to have more sons who are going to learn to worship and follow the Lord, and to learn what it really means to be human, so that when we get the big shining city, we have something firm to set it on, not just this swamp of sin. And next week, we're going to read more about a descendant of Seth, even as we follow the line of Cain, and we got Lamech, right? This guy who takes multiple wives and kills this guy who insults him or wounds him or does whatever, and he goes and he makes a song and brags about it. Next week, we're going to look at a descendant of Seth, and you probably know his name. His name is Noah. Noah is next week. So I'm super excited you got a chance to tune in. If you've got any questions, you can reach out to me or throw something in comments or whatever, and I would be happy to answer them. But we get to see here in just the very first pages of the Bible. In my Bible, I only have, this is the first page. Genesis 1 starts on this side, and then I got the whole back page, and then on this page is where we're at. So we're right there at the beginning, and what God has to tell us about himself and about ourselves. And we're learning that all of human advancement, right? All of human creation and all of our smarticles, all of our innovation is corrupted by sin. And we can't advance out of it without the help of God. We have to turn to him and follow him and look to him, right? To be saved, to find meaning. That it's only in the worship of the Lord, not in our own advancement or our own solutions to problems, that we are going to find salvation. But God is faithful to bring it, and he's doing it through the line of Seth. And that's next week with our boy Noah. Bye, guys.